Salesforce administrator first, and then also a developer. I actually started working with Salesforce.com when we implemented about 3 years ago. I'm going to be talking about triggers. So by show of hands, how many of you have ever written a trigger or have looked at a trigger? Okay, so that's good. How many of you feel comfortable in code? Okay. How many of you feel comfortable in process builder and or workflow rules? Okay. Keep your hands up. How many of you work a lot in process builder today? Okay. So there are some references to process builder. So if you're not super comfortable with process builder, it's okay. But reach out to me afterwards so that we can help make things even more better. I'm really good with English. So thank you to our sponsors. All right, so the first thing that I want to talk about is what is a trigger. So if you go to the Wikipedia article, a trigger is a really confusing thing that does things, which isn't a helpful article, by the way, in my opinion. So what I really like to reference is the Apex Developer Guide. You'll hear me talk about the Developer Guide a lot because I think it's a great place to go if you have questions. But the Apex Developer Guide calls a trigger Apex code that executes before or after the following types of operations: insert, update, delete, merge, upsert, undelete. So do those words sound familiar? Does everybody use data loader? So those words are words from data loader, right? Right. So I like to think of triggers in admin terms, right? So triggers are like workflows, process builders, and flows, except they're code, not clicks. So you have to tell the system exactly what you want it to do, because what you're doing is you're replacing that drag and drop kind of stuff with a bunch of code instead. Cool? Cool. So our database trigger is evil. So depending on who you talk to, you might get that they're a little bit evil sometimes. But according to Stack Overflow, that's not a constructive question, at all. It's a legit question on the stack. So yeah, but there are some things that you need to consider before you go and implement a lot of code in your production work. So I have this cool little flow. Sorry for the volume. So the first thing that we always want to think about is the business need that you're going to start developing for. Is it really a business need? Because if it's not a business need, we need to politely decline the project. Say, I'm sorry that I'm just not going to build this for you because it's really not a business need. How many of you say no today? Everybody's hand should be up because you should always feel comfortable going back to the business and saying, I know that you think Salesforce is cool, and it's really cool that you want to do this in Salesforce, but maybe this isn't something that we should be doing in Salesforce. I think that's one of the most important things that I learned my first year because I never used to say no. And then once you're the solo admin supporting a million processes with a million different work groups, and somebody wants to change something here and change that, it just gets really bad really quickly. So if it shouldn't live in Salesforce, don't let it live in Salesforce. So the second, we'll move down to yes. Is this possible declaratively? So if you're thinking about building something for somebody who's asked you to do something, can you do it in a flow? Can you do it in a workflow? Can you do it in a process builder? And if you can, is it really complex? So is it a process builder that calls to a flow, that calls to 20 different subflows? Because if it's that many things, maybe it'd be best to look into code because you can simplify things in code, right? So if it's not complex, then why are we talking about code? I'm going to show you a really simple example of a trigger, but if you have the business requirement that's behind my trigger, which is to change a company name, you should probably do that in a flow, not in a trigger. The reason I'm doing it in a trigger today is because you have to start somewhere. Right, so I didn't want to come in here with a crazy trigger that was 500 lines of doing I don't write triggers that are 500 lines. But anyway, I didn't want to come in here with a really complex trigger because I wanted you to understand where we were going with this talk. But yeah, so moving on. Once we get to this decision that we're going to write code, we need to start thinking about maintenance, right? So by show of hands again, how many of you feel comfortable in the code? Not as many, right? So when we start putting code into the org, especially if we're learning, and a business requirement changes, that can add a lot of time to you going in and modifying the code and making it work for the new business reason, right? So we need to think about maintenance when we're going to be introducing code into our org to make sure that we have enough time to go ahead and fulfill the requirements in whatever the business need would be. So there's that. And then if we don't have code maintenance concerns, we'll build it in code. If we do, we'll probably go back to the business and say, look, it's possible in code, but I'm not your person, right? So then the next thing you'll see, both when we build declaratively and when we build with code, we're going to test the crap out of it. That's just a good best practice. You can never test too much. Well, I guess you could, but then we're going to deploy it. The caveat with deploying code is that how many of you have deployed something into your production org? You think it's working, and then it's like, shit. With code, you can't just click off. Like, you actually have to go back into your sandbox and deactivate it and then redeploy it, unless you're connecting in a special way, which I'm not going to tell you about, but it's totally possible. Yeah, so anyway, that's just one extra thing that you have to think about, because if you say shit and the stuff that you've built is declarative, you can just turn it off really quickly in prod, and it's usually, okay, it's not going to kill anyone. But if you say shit and it's code, sometimes it can take a few hours to fix that shit. So. Thanks. All right. So, okay. So what object, So people like to throw these like really big, weird words around when they're talking about code because it makes you sound really cool. But sometimes it's confusing. Apex is an object-oriented language. Does anybody know what that means? Yeah, me neither. I'm teaching today. So when we think about object-oriented languages, let's think back in workflow terms. So triggers run when something happens on an object. When we think about an object, we're going to think about the account, the case, the lead, the opportunity. These are different objects, right? So when we say Apex is an object-oriented language, what we're saying is our code is going to run on specific objects. Does everybody understand that now? Yeah. Sweet. So then the other thing is trigger events. So when we're talking about triggers, we'll talk about before triggers and we'll talk about after triggers. And these are sometimes the same thing, but most of the time we like to think about them a little differently because it's running at different times, right? So I have a really weird thing coming up now. So if you're not getting this, like, it's going to be cool. We're going to talk about teeth. I'm not joking. So before triggers fire during the before insert, the before update, and the before delete. After triggers fire during an after insert, after update, after delete, after undelete. So we have before something happens, then after something happens. So before you insert a lead, does the lead have a Salesforce ID? No. So if we wanted to do something with that ID, would we write a before trigger? No. So that's an example of why you would use an after trigger instead of a before trigger. And here we're going to talk about teeth. I wasn't joking. All right, so I like to think of them as braces. So how many of you had braces when you were growing up? Good number. Sweet. I was hoping for that. I was like, yeah, one person's going to raise their hand and nobody will get it. So the first thing an orthodontist does when they're getting ready to put braces on your teeth is they'll pick out your brackets for every individual tooth, right? So let's think about teeth as records in a system. So the trigger is going to run on every individual record, right? So we're going to put a bracket on this tooth, then a bracket on this tooth, and a bracket on this tooth. So right now we're writing a before trigger because we're prepping for the braces, right? So brackets on the tooth before trigger. Then the braces are actually applied to the teeth. So we picked out the brackets, we're putting them on the teeth. So that's the verb, that's the middle part. Now we're gonna put a band connecting those brackets together. We're relating those in some way. So that's the after. So the before, picking out the brackets. The during, we're putting the brackets on the teeth. And then the after, we're putting the band on the brackets, connecting them all together. So the reason I'm talking about braces, I hated braces. I stopped wearing my retainer and I started biting the inside of my lip recently. And I can't find where I put my retainer. Sorry. But yeah. It's bad. So before triggers update or validate records before they're saved, they're similar to this thing in the process builder. Remember, select, have you all seen this? Okay, cool. So when we say select the account record that started the process, we're selecting the same thing. So that's the tooth. We're actually touching that same tooth that we put the bracket on. So that's our before trigger. Most of our triggers are before triggers, because if you think about things you want to do with triggers, it's usually like, well, I want to scrub this before I insert this, right? I want to make sure that this data is clean, or I want to add some element of something here. Most triggers are before triggers. And then after triggers, they perform operations on records after they're saved. Usually it's the related record stuff, right? So when we're putting those bands on, we're relating things. Okay. Is everybody getting this? Does that make sense? Okay. If you get confused, please stop me and be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, cool. So when we're thinking about this, before and after, those are kind of events on a timeline, right? So we need to be very cognitive of the order of execution. So things happen in order. There's actually 20 steps on the Salesforce order of execution site on DeveloperForce. I took math. Did you take math? Remember PEMDAS? Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So like, if you're working a math problem and you have exponents and parentheses and fractions in the problem, you have to do things in a certain order to get to the same answer that the calculator is going to give you. And if you do things out of order, you're going to get a wacky answer, and it might be right to you, but it's wrong to the system, which would be the calculator. And that's very similar to Salesforce. So it's important to know that this order exists, because a lot of times you'll want to do something on an assignment rule. So like, for example, I've been living in territory management, and I feel like this is becoming like a confessional. Anyway, I've been hating my life in territory management until I realized that this was happening, because I was trying to write a before trigger that was grabbing related information that already existed on the account and putting it based on assignment rules that we're going to fire later on in the trigger into a field on the account. But the thing was, like, the triggers are firing in step 1 and step 3. Assignment rules are in 4. So I was never getting to that place where it was making sense to me, and it's because this order of operations executes the same way every time. So even though the assignment rules exist, they weren't firing to do their thing in a way that the trigger could access the data that they were doing their thing to. Does that make sense? So it's just important to know, like, if something's not working, come back to like the order of execution and check it out. Make sure that that's not why it's not working. All right, so let's pretend that you went through your flow and you decided you need to write a trigger. And by the way, you better not write a trigger for the example that I'm showing you. Okay, all right, so the first thing that you need to do is find a safe location to build your trigger. Long story short, no, not even short. When I first started writing code, we have this org called UAT, and it's a sandbox, and there's maybe 20 people in it, and like nothing important is happening in there, right? So, yeah, I got a call from my boss's boss, who was like, we're testing this application right now. Nothing is working. Do you know why? I was like, yeah, I wrote some code and it broke your shit. So, like, don't do that. Like, create your own sandbox. So if you break something, it's not going to affect other people. That was the point of that story. So what we're going to do is go to developer console in the top right corner where you have your name. You're going to say developer console. And then we're going to create a new trigger by going File, New, Apex Trigger. We're going to name it something like object trigger name. The object would be like lead or account, so it could be account and then whatever we're going to name our trigger. The reason I do that is because it makes it easier when you're trying to grab stuff in a change set, since it's all, I usually sort alphabetically. You can go down to the lead section, you're like, I need this trigger, I need this class, and it's just much easier to find what you need. But then what we're going to do is we're going to select lead, because our example, I keep on making out with this thing. Our example is lead, right? So we're gonna select, sorry sound people. Yeah, okay. So our example is S object, the S object is lead. So we have lead, trigger example, lead. Then we're gonna click submit. This stuff will pre-populate in the developer console. So it'll be trigger, lead example, or lead, trigger, example, I can't read either, on lead before insert. So we see trigger, that's our keyword. We're telling the system that we're writing a trigger. We see lead, trigger, example. That's the name that we gave it. If you look into the little box, that's the name of our trigger. Then we see on lead, so the trigger is going to fire on the lead object. And then before insert. Can anybody tell me when it's going to happen? Before an insert, right? We just wrote a trigger! Woo! So not really. It doesn't do anything. Cool. All right, so now we have two options. We can put all of our work into the trigger, or we can put all of our work into a helper class. What is a helper class? So today we're not going to get really deep into what helper classes are and how you should use them instead of writing all your work into trigger, which is why I don't have 500 lines in my triggers. But I'm going to cover them very briefly so you know which door to pick. Triggers are like process builders. I keep on drawing this kind of parallel, right? So if we think about a helper class, what it's going to do is instead of writing your step-by-step instructions in the trigger, you're telling, the code, remember you have to tell the system exactly what to do and when to do it. Instead of putting all of that stuff in the trigger, what you want to do is have one trigger that says to its friend, the helper class, I have a record, what do I do with it? And then the helper class says, in this order, this is what you're going to do to it, right? So you're going to take the trigger's going to say, look, help me out. And the helper class is going to do the stuff. So when we see in this screenshot, we see scrub account billing, email account owner. Those are two methods. It's like the verb for code. Those are methods in the helper class, right? So none of that stuff would actually exist in a trigger if you're doing things according to best practice. Best practice is one trigger per object and one or more helper classes. Because we're newbies, we don't have to follow best practice. Let's follow worst practice. So that it gets a little bit complicated because you have to pass information from the trigger into the helper class and then pass information back from the helper class into the trigger. So this is where we want to be someday, but we're not going to get there today. So for simplicity, we're going to choose door number 1, put all the work in the trigger. If you tell a developer who's been developing a lot for years that you're going to do this kind of stuff, they'll probably get you to do it differently, but they'll also probably confuse the shit out of you. Okay, so in the following example code, we're going to be updating sales space force in the company name of an incoming lead to Salesforce. Because that really bothers me. If you're not talking about a sales team, if you're talking about Salesforce, it should be one word, and there should be no extra capital F's anywhere. Am I the only one that feels like that? No? Okay, good. All right, oh my gosh. So there's so much code. Okay. Can everybody see the numbers of the lines on the screen? Okay, so I'm going to go line by line because I don't have a laser pointer. So we see in line 1 this slash and this asterisk. And so the slash and the asterisk is really, I'm going to be starting a comment, right? So anything that you see in brown on the screen, it's commented out. The system knows that that's not functioning. So we see that trigger lead, trigger example on lead before insert, before update. So this trigger is going to happen both before the insert and before any updates to the record. That's on line 6. And then we're going to skip down. I commented this so that if you want to revisit it, it's already posted on my blog. But we see this on line 10, for lead in bucket, colon, trigger new, what the hell? Okay, so what this is saying, this is a loop, and it's saying for every lead that this trigger comes across, we're gonna call that lead in bucket. That's gonna be the variable that we're gonna give the lead. And then the colon means in, and then trigger.new is any time that this trigger is firing. Right? So for every lead that this trigger comes across, any time that the trigger fires, do something. So the open bracket is anything between the brackets it's going to do. So then we jump down to, is everybody understanding so far? Okay. So we're going to jump down to line 14 and we say if lead in bucket dot company. So if the company field on the lead is equal to sales space force with a capital S, capital F, then we want to do something. And then we see back on line 16 leadandbucket.company equals Salesforce. So we're reassigning it to the word Salesforce instead of 2 words, sales space force. Does that make sense? By show of hands, does that make sense? Sweet. Yay! So it works. Now what? Okay, so I'm almost running out of time, but it's totally fine. It's really, really important that you have code coverage. So by code coverage, I mean everything that we write, we have to make sure it works in a systematic way. So it's like the system saying, you got this, it works. So test classes give you code coverage. Simply put, test classes are like automated tests, I already said this, that create your test data, and then you do like something called a system assert to assert that your test data is like correct by the end of the time the test runs. So I'm gonna show you with our bonus content. I know you signed up for triggers. Sorry we're talking about classes, but I feel like this is really important stuff. So in Developer Console, you click New Apex Class, and then what I do is I just rename everything with test at the end. So I know that we're creating a class, but I'm calling it lead trigger test because it's a test class for the lead trigger. Again, it's just an organizational thing for me. Like it makes it really easy for me to know exactly what it's doing. Oh, some more code. So I'm not gonna go as in depth on this because this is a trigger session, but we see at the very top in line 1, we have like an @is_test. No, we're not tweeting to Salesforce. What this means is that this is a test class. Then we see private class, blah, blah, blah. On line 8, what we're doing is we're creating a new lead that fits the criteria of our trigger. So remember, our trigger is gonna look for companies with the name sales space force. That's what we're doing on line 8 through line 13. Then on line 14, we're inserting that new lead into the system. Don't worry, it's not actually going anywhere because this is a test class. So Salesforce is smart enough to not pollute your data with junk that you have in your test classes. Then we see on line 17, we're gonna start searching for that new lead. And then on line 23, we've found that new lead and we're comparing the company to what we want it to be. So after we've inserted our junk record that needs to be cleaned, what we're doing in line 23 is we're saying, did the trigger clean it? So at no point we're actually running that trigger. Salesforce is running it when you do the insert because the trigger runs before the insert. And then it's asserting that it corrected the lead on the insert. Does that make sense? Okay. So then I said that you need 75% code coverage. So in order to deploy any code into production, you have to have at least 75% in your production org covered, which means that your code is working. So you can go test, run all in your thing, Developer Console, that one. And then when the test classes pass, you can get really excited. All right. So here's where you can estimate all of your code coverage in the UI. It's navigate to setup, then it's Apex classes, and then there's actually a link you can just click and it'll tell you what your code coverage is. All right, so then here's my last slide. I made it. First things first, when I first started, I thought, well, I can't copy and paste anything because I'm plagiarizing if I do that. And the truth is, everybody does it. Everybody does it. So it's not bad if you find somebody's code on a blog, and even if it's exactly what you want and you don't have to change it at all, it's totally fine to rip and rob. They're not gonna find out. And even if they do find out, they'll be flattered that you're using their code. They spent time developing that code. The second thing is no negative thinking. So I got into this mindset where I would write something and it wouldn't work. And then I would feel like crying. And sometimes I did cry. And the thing is, it's okay because that sweat equity pays off. Even if your code isn't working the first time you write something, you're that much better for trying, right? And then practice makes perfect. So eventually, maybe the 90th time you make a change, it'll work. And then you'll be like, oh my God, it's amazing. You can tweet about it. Then there's a lot of resources. So my favorites are the Apex 10 commandments. When you start, it's awesome. The developer trail on Trailhead, you have to do the developer trails. They are so phenomenally freaking awesome. the searching for answers in the developer discussions, it's always a great place to search for answers. It's always a great place to ask questions. Ask questions on Stack Exchange if you're ready to get lectured. I'm totally joking. You can tell them I said that. So yeah, it's a scary place. And then there's a lot of really great blogs, and I have to really say that the two that I use the most are SFDC 99 and then also Women Code Heroes, because those are the places that I learned. And then like I have to say a special thanks to Kieran, who runs, I know she's not here, but like she went through my deck with me and it really helped me like, you know, fix some of my broken stuff in my deck. So yeah, thank you. She's not here. You can tweet to her and say, Shannon says thanks. But that's it, and thank you for your time, and thank you for joining. And all of this is on my blog, and I'm gonna go back to that slide.